In the heart of Chicago, 1999, the Regal Hotel's grand ballroom was a spectacle of light and life. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars, casting a warm golden glow over more than 300 guests. The air buzzed with laughter, the clink of champagne flutes, and the upbeat swing of a live jazz band that kept the dance floor alive. At the center of it all stood Elena Voss, the bride, radiant in a flowing white gown that shimmered with every movement. Beside her, on a flower-draped stage, was Daniel Harper, her groom, his smile as bright as the future they'd planned together. The couple was a beacon of joy, their love palpable as they exchanged glances amidst the swirl of celebration. Guests in tuxedos and glittering dresses moved through the room, their voices weaving a tapestry of congratulations and toasts. The wedding was a triumph, a moment of perfection in a world that rarely allowed it. But in the shadows, unnoticed by the revelers, stood a figure in a black hood, his presence a faint disturbance in the festive chaos. His face was obscured, his posture still, as if he existed outside the rhythm of the night. No one paid him any mind, until 11, when the world fell into darkness. The power cut was sudden, a blade slicing through the merriment. The chandeliers flickered once, then died, plunging the ballroom into an inky void. The music stopped mid-note, replaced by a collective gasp that rippled through the crowd. Darkness swallowed the hall, thick and suffocating, disorienting even the most composed guests. Screams erupted, sharp and panicked, as people stumbled over chairs and collided in blind confusion. Voices called out for help, for light, for exits, but the heavy oak doors, ornate and imposing, were locked from the outside, their handles unyielding under desperate hands. The air grew heavy with a metallic tang, a sickening undercurrent that crept beneath the chaos. Strange sounds echoed in the blackness, sharp metallic scrapes, like blades being drawn, followed by wet guttural noises that no one wanted to name. A shadow moved through the crowd, swift and deliberate, its presence felt more than seen. It struck with precision, a predator in a sea of prey, its movements silent but deadly. Guests who felt the brush of its passing didn't live to scream. 7 minutes later, the lights snapped back on, revealing a scene that would haunt Chicago for decades. The ballroom was a slaughterhouse. 42 bodies lay scattered across the floor, their lifeless forms sprawled over tables, slumped against walls, or crumpled on the dance floor, where moments ago they'd been dancing. Blood streaked the pristine white tablecloths, pooled on the polished hardwood, and splattered the gilded walls in grotesque patterns. Daniel Harper, the groom, lay at the edge of the stage, his throat slashed open, his eyes frozen in a moment of shock and betrayal. The air was thick with the stench of death, a cloying mix of blood and fear that choked the survivors, those fortunate or unfortunate enough to have been spared. At the center of the carnage was Elena, still on the stage, her white gown now a crimson-soaked relic. She lay unconscious, her body curled delicately as if placed there with care, her breathing shallow but steady. Not a single wound marked her skin, a stark and inexplicable contrast to the massacre around her. Police sirens wailed in the distance, as first responders forced their way through the locked doors. The scene they encountered was beyond comprehension, even for officers hardened by Chicago's violent streets. Veteran cops stood speechless, their faces pale as they surveyed the carnage. The sheer scale of the massacre was staggering. 42 dead in under 10 minutes, with no clear motive, no witnesses who could explain the chaos, and no suspect in sight. Paramedics rushed to Elena, their hands shaking as they checked her vitals. She stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening, her body untouched by the violence that had claimed so many others. The survivors, a scattered handful of guests, who'd been near the edges of the room, were incoherent with some wept, others stared blankly, their minds struggling to process the horror. Detectives moved through the scene, their boots sticking to the blood-slicked floor, their notebooks filling with observations that raised more questions than answers. Witnesses, still trembling, spoke in fragmented sentences about a hooded figure they'd glimpsed before the blackout. A woman in a sequined dress recalled seeing him near the bar, his head bowed, his hands hidden in his sleeve. A man in a tuxedo swore he'd seen the figure move toward the stage, just before the lights went out, his gait unnervingly smooth, like a shadow gliding across water. Others claimed he'd vanished into the crowd, a ghost swallowed by the chaos. The stories were vague, contradictory, but one detail was consistent. The figure wore a black hood, and no one had seen his face. The hotel's CCTV footage offered the only concrete lead, though it was far from clear. The grainy video showed the ballroom in its final moments of joy, guests laughing and dancing, Elena and Daniel glowing on the stage. At 10:58 p.m., the hooded figure appeared in the frame, weaving through the crowd with purpose. He approached Elena, his movements deliberate, and leaned close to her ear. His lips moved, as if whispering something, his hooded face inches from hers. Then, as the lights flickered, he stepped back and melted into the crowd. Seconds later, the blackout began, and the killing started. Elena was rushed to a hospital, still unconscious, under heavy police guard. Detectives waited anxiously for her to wake, hoping she could shed light on the nightmare. When she finally opened her eyes hours later, she was surrounded by sterile white walls and the steady beep of a heart monitor. Her hands shook as she clutched the hospital blanket, her eyes darting around the room, as if expecting the hooded figure to emerge from the shadows. Detectives sat at her bedside, their questions gentle but urgent. She struggled to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, her memories fragmented by trauma. She remembered Daniel's hand in hers, the warmth of his smile as they stood on the stage. She remembered the music, the laughter, the joy of the moment, and then nothing, only a voice, low and deliberate, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "You are not meant to die tonight." The words had been clear, chilling, spoken directly into her ear. Then the world went black, and she remembered nothing, until the hospital. The detectives exchanged glances, their notepads filling with questions they couldn't answer. Why was Elena spared? Was she a random survivor, a fluke in the killer's rampage, or was she the center of the entire massacre, the one person he'd chosen to leave alive? The precision of the attack suggested intent, a calculated slaughter that left her untouched while 42 others died. The CCTV footage confirmed the killer had approached her, whispered to her, before vanishing into the chaos. But what had he said, and why had he spared her? The questions gnawed at the investigators, as they combed through the evidence, chasing threads that led nowhere. Forensics revealed little. The wounds were precise, likely made by a single blade, wielded with skill that suggested military or surgical training. The power outage was no accident. Someone had sabotaged the hotel's electrical system, timing the blackout to perfection. The locked doors, too, had been tampered with, sealed with a mechanism that required tools and planning. This was no impulsive act. It was a masterpiece of death. Elena's survival became the focal point of the investigation. Though she had little to offer, she was fragile, her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The detectives pressed gently, asking about her past, her enemies, anyone who might have wanted to harm her or Daniel. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She and Daniel had been happy, their lives unremarkable. She worked as a librarian. He was an architect. They'd met at a coffee shop 2 years earlier. Their romance, a quiet, steady thing. There were no jilted exes, no hidden debts, no secrets that could explain the carnage. But the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Elena was the key. The killer had spared her, had spoken to her, had left her alive in a room full of death. Why? The investigation took a darker turn when a detective uncovered a file from 1979, buried in the Chicago PD's archives. When Elena was 8 years old, her family home in a quiet suburb had been attacked. Her parents, 2 siblings,
and even the family dog was slaughtered in a single night. The scene was eerily similar to the wedding massacre. Blood-soaked walls, locked doors, no clear motive. Elena, found hiding in a closet, was the only survivor. The case had gone cold, the killer never caught, but witnesses from that night had reported a shadowy figure fleeing the scene, cloaked in a dark hood. The parallels were chilling. The same method, the same survivor, the same phantom. Detectives began to wonder if the wedding massacre was connected to Elena's childhood, if the killer had been watching her for decades. Elena, still in the hospital, was unaware of the discovery, but her nightmares were growing worse. She saw flashes of blood, heard screams that might have been her family's, or the wedding guests, and always in the shadows of her dreams was the hooded figure, his face hidden but his presence suffocating. She woke screaming, her nurses rushing to calm her. The police placed her under 24-hour protection, moving her to a secure facility as the media frenzy grew. Chicago was gripped by the story. Headlines screaming about the bride's shadow, a nickname coined by a tabloid. Reporters camped outside the hospital, speculating wildly about the killer's motives. Was he a serial killer, obsessed with Elena, a stalker with a twisted sense of devotion, or something darker, something that defied explanation? A breakthrough came days later, when investigators found a disturbing piece of evidence hidden in the hotel's sound system. Wired into the speakers, concealed with meticulous care, was an audio tape. The recording was brief, but chilling. A male voice, calm and deliberate, spoke. "She belongs to me. Only she lives. Everyone else must die." The words sent a shiver through the investigative team. The voice was untraceable. The tape wiped clean of fingerprints. It was a taunt, a declaration of ownership that pointed to an obsession with Elena. The detectives played the tape for her, watching her reaction closely. She paled, her hands trembling as she listened. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the voice I heard." But she couldn't offer more. No name, no face, no reason why she'd been chosen. The tape shifted the investigation's focus. This wasn't just a massacre. It was a ritual, a message carved in blood. The killer had planned every detail, from the blackout to the locked doors to the precise strikes that claimed 42 lives in minutes. But his fixation on Elena was the heart of it all. Detectives began digging into her life with renewed urgency, interviewing anyone who'd ever known her. Friends, co-workers, even distant relatives were questioned, but no one could point to a suspect. Elena's life, on the surface, was ordinary. She was kind, quiet, a woman who kept to herself after the trauma of her childhood. Yet the killer had marked her, had spared her twice, and now he'd left a message that echoed with possessiveness. The police set up a task force, pulling in experts from across the country. Profilers suggested the killer was male, likely in his 30s or 40s, with a background that allowed for meticulous planning and physical prowess. But the lack of physical evidence frustrated them. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of the killer beyond the tape and the grainy CCTV footage. The hooded figure seemed to exist outside the realm of evidence, a phantom who struck and vanished. The task force combed through similar cases, looking for patterns, but found only whispers of other massacres with single survivors, none as brazen as the wedding. The media, meanwhile, turned Elena into a symbol. Some called her a victim, others a curse. Online forums buzzed with theories, from conspiracy nuts claiming she was in league with the killer, to romantics who saw her as a tragic figure, marked by a dark protector. Elena, now discharged from the hospital and moved to a safe house, felt the weight of it all. She couldn't mourn Daniel properly, couldn't face the families of the victims who looked at her with suspicion. She spent her days in isolation, guarded by officers who watched her as much as they protected her. The safe house was a small apartment, its windows covered, its walls bare. She kept a journal, writing down every detail she could remember, hoping to find some clue to the killer's identity. The voice haunted her, its cadence familiar yet unreachable. She began to wonder if she'd heard it before the wedding, perhaps in her childhood, perhaps in the shadows of her nightmare. The thought terrified her that the killer had been with her all along, a constant presence she'd never noticed. One night, as she sat in the safe house, a storm rolled in, thunder shaking the windows. She was writing in her journal, trying to recall the night her family died. The details were hazy, but she remembered the closet, the smell of her mother's coats, the sound of footsteps outside, and the voice, always the voice, "You are not meant to die." She froze, her pen hovering over the page. A new memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. The footsteps had stopped at the closet door, but it never opened. The killer had known she was there, had chosen to spare her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a survivor, she was chosen, marked by a killer who saw her as his own. And now, 20 years later, he'd come for her again, leaving a trail of bodies to prove it. The storm grew louder, rain pounding the roof. Elena's heart raced as she stared at her journal, the words blurring through tears. She didn't know who the killer was, but she knew he wasn't finished. The tape, the massacre, the voice, they were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. And somewhere, in the shadows of Chicago, or beyond, he was watching, waiting for the moment to claim her again.
The safe house was a fortress of solitude, a nondescript apartment on the edge of a city far from Chicago's towering skyline. Elena Voss, now living under the alias Sarah Klein, kept the curtains drawn tight, the world outside reduced to slivers of light that slipped through the cracks. The air inside was stale, heavy with the weight of her fear. Triple locked doors and police patrols offered little comfort. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a streetlight sent her heart racing. She hadn't slept properly since the wedding massacre, her nights plagued by nightmares of blood-soaked gowns, Daniel's lifeless eyes, and the hooded figure whose presence clung to her like a shadow. The audio tape's chilling words, "She belongs to me, only she lives. Everyone else must die," played on a loop in her mind, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. Elena was no longer just a survivor. She was a prisoner of a killer who had marked her twice, first in her childhood and now on the night that should have been her happiest. Her days were spent in isolation, under the watchful eyes of police officers who guarded her as much as they suspected her. The safe house was sparse, a sagging couch, a small kitchen table, a bed she rarely used. Her only companion was a worn leather journal, its pages filled with frantic notes, fragmented memories, and questions that led nowhere. She wrote about the wedding, the blackout, the voice that whispered, "You are not meant to die tonight." She wrote about the night in 1979, when she was 8, hiding in a closet, as her family was slaughtered. The details of that night were blurry, shrouded in the fog of childhood trauma, but one memory had sharpened, the voice through the closet door, low and deliberate, the same voice from the wedding. "You are not meant to die." The realization that the same killer had spared her twice consumed her, gnawing at her sanity. Why her? What did he want? The questions were a torment, each one a thread she pulled at, hoping to unravel the mystery of the hooded figure. Elena avoided mirrors, unable to face the woman she'd become. Her once bright eyes were hollow, her face gaunt from sleepless nights and constant fear. Daniel's memory haunted her, his warm smile, the way he'd held her hand on the stage, the future they'd planned now reduced to ashes. She hadn't been allowed to attend his funeral. The police deemed it too dangerous, fearing the killer might strike again. The families of the 42 victims blamed her, their whispers cutting deeper than any blame. She saw it in their eyes, during the brief interviews before she was whisked away. Why was she alive when their loved ones were dead? The guilt was a living thing, clawing at her chest. She'd loved Daniel, had dreamed of a life with him, but now she wondered if her love had doomed him. Had her survival come at the cost of everyone else? The Chicago police were no closer to answers. The wedding massacre, dubbed the bride's shadow by the press, had gripped the city,
dominating headlines and fueling a media frenzy. Detectives worked tirelessly, but the case was a labyrinth of dead ends. The CCTV footage showed the hooded figure whispering to Elena before vanishing into the crowd, but his face was obscured, his movements untraceable. The audio tape, found wired into the hotel's sound system, offered no forensic clues, no fingerprints, no DNA, just that chilling voice claiming ownership of Elena. Forensics confirmed the massacre's precision: 42 kills in 7 minutes, each wound delivered with surgical accuracy, likely by a single assailant wielding a blade. The locked doors, the sabotaged power, the meticulous planning. It was a masterpiece of death, orchestrated by a phantom who left no trace. Detective Ruiz, the lead on the case, was a grizzled veteran with a reputation for tenacity, but even he was stumped. He visited Elena often, his notebook filled with questions he knew she couldn't answer. "We're doing everything we can, Sarah," he said using her alias, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But this guy, he's a ghost." Ruiz and his team had scoured Elena's life, interviewing friends, co-workers, anyone who might know something. Her past was unremarkable after the childhood tragedy: a quiet life, a job as a librarian, a romance with Daniel that seemed plucked from a fairy tale. Yet the killer had targeted her, had spared her while slaughtering everyone around her. The 1979 massacre, uncovered in the archives, only deepened the mystery. The similarities were undeniable: the locked doors, the blood-soaked walls, the hooded figure glimpsed by neighbors. Elena had been the sole survivor then too, a pattern that chilled Ruiz to the core. Elena's nightmares grew worse, blending the past and present into a relentless cycle of terror. She saw her family's house, the closet where she'd hidden, the screams of her parents and siblings. She saw the wedding, the blackout, Daniel's body at her feet, and always, the hooded figure, his face hidden but his presence suffocating, his voice a constant whisper in her mind. She woke screaming, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. The police guards outside her door rushed in, their faces a mix of concern and frustration. They didn't understand her fear. Not fully. They hadn't heard the voice, hadn't felt the weight of being chosen by a killer who saw her as his own. She began to question her own memories, wondering if she'd seen the hooded figure before the wedding. Had he been there in the corners of her life, watching from the shadow? She remembered small, unsettling moments: a shadow outside her college dorm window, a stranger lingering too long at her old job, a note slipped under her apartment door years ago, with no signature, just the words, "I see." She dismissed them as paranoia, the lingering effects of her childhood trauma, but now they felt like pieces of a puzzle, clues to a presence that had haunted her for decades. She wrote them down in her journal, her handwriting shaky, her thoughts spiraling. The killer wasn't just a one-time monster, he was a constant, a shadow woven into the fabric of her life. Elena's isolation was broken only by her research. Using a secure laptop provided by the police, she dug into old news articles about the 1979 massacre. The reports were sparse, overshadowed by Chicago's bigger crimes, but they painted a grim picture: her family's home, a quiet suburban house, turned into a slaughterhouse in a single night. Neighbors had heard screams, but saw nothing until it was over. One detail stood out: a witness had glimpsed a hooded figure, fleeing the scene, moving with an eerie grace that matched the wedding footage. Elena's heart pounded as she read. She searched for other cases, other massacres with single survivors, hoping to find a pattern. She found nothing concrete, but the absence of answers only fueled her obsession. She began sketching the hooded figure from memory. His silhouette burned into her mind. The drawings filled pages, each one more detailed, more desperate, as if capturing his image could somehow trap him. One evening, a storm rolled in, thunder shaking the safe house's thin walls. Elena sat at the kitchen table, her journal open, her pen scratching out another memory. She was trying to recall the night her family died, the details that had eluded her for years. She remembered the closet, the smell of her mother's coats, the sound of footsteps outside. The voice had come then through the wooden slats. "You are not meant to die." The door never opened. The footsteps retreated, and she'd been found hours later, unharmed amidst the carnage. A new thought struck her, chilling her to the bone. The killer had known she was in the closet. He'd stood there inches away, and chosen to spare her. The realization made her dizzy. She wasn't just a survivor. She was his chosen, marked for a purpose she couldn't fathom. The storm grew louder, rain pounding the roof. A knock at the door startled her, sharp and insistent. She froze, her pen hovering over the page. No one knew where she lived, not her co-workers, not the police beyond Ruiz's team, not even the few friends she'd left behind. The knock came again, softer this time, almost deliberate. Her pulse hammered as she crept to the door, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching. No one was there. But when she opened the door, a small envelope lay on the mat, rain-soaked but intact. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside was a single photograph. Elena on her wedding day, smiling on the stage, moments before the blackout. On the back, in sharp black ink, were the words, "I'm still here." She called Ruiz immediately, her voice shaking as she explained the photo. He arrived within the hour, his face grim, as he examined the envelope. It yielded no clues, no prints, no DNA, just like the tape. "We'll increase patrols," he promised, but his tone was resigned, as if he knew it wouldn't matter. "Stay inside, Sarah. Don't open the door for anyone." Elena nodded, but the words felt hollow. The killer was close, closer than ever, and he wanted her to know it. She didn't sleep that night, sitting with a kitchen knife in her hand, the photo on the table in front of her. The image of her smiling, oblivious to the horror about to unfold, was a cruel reminder of what she'd lost. The killer was playing with her, taunting her with his presence, his power. The next morning, Elena made a decision. She couldn't live like this, a prisoner to fear, waiting for the killer to strike again. If the police couldn't find him, she would. She began reaching out to old contacts, using the burner phone Ruiz had given her. She tracked down a retired detective, John Carver, who'd worked the 1979 case, now living in a small town outside Chicago. Carver was old, his voice crackling over the phone, but his memory was sharp. "That case haunted me," he told her. "Your family's house. It was like the devil walked through it. Blood everywhere, no forced entry, no evidence. And you, kid, you were a miracle hiding in that closet." He paused, his voice softening. "But miracles don't come free. Whoever did this, they wanted you alive for a reason." Carver's words stayed with her, fueling her resolve. She contacted a private investigator, Frank Malone, a grizzled ex-cop, who specialized in cold cases. She sent him everything: her journal, the photo, copies of the 1979 police report. Malone was skeptical, but intrigued, his voice gruff over their first call. "This isn't just a killer," he said after reviewing her materials. "He's a planner, a predator, and he's got a reason for keeping you alive. We need to figure out what it is." Malone dug into the case with a tenacity that matched Elena's desperation. He uncovered a faint lead, a string of unsolved murders in Chicago, dating back to the 1970s, all with a single survivor. The cases were spread out, the connections subtle, but the similarities were there: locked doors, precise kills, a hooded figure in witness reports. Elena and Malone worked together, chasing threads across decades. They interviewed survivors, combed through archives, and built a timeline that painted a chilling picture. The killer wasn't just obsessed with Elena. He was tied to others, a shadow that struck and vanished, always leaving one person alive. But Elena was different. He'd come for her twice, marking her as his own. Malone began to suspect something darker, something beyond a human killer. "This guy doesn't age," he said one night, his voice low over a secure line. Witness descriptions from the 70s matched the wedding footage exactly. Same build, same hood, same grace. Either we're dealing with a copycat, or... He trailed off, unwilling to voice the impossible. Elena dismissed the idea at first, clinging to logic. But Malone's words planted a seed. She found an old article about a 1960s Chicago cult, the Order of the Keeper, that worshipped a figure they called the Keeper. They believed in a chosen one, a woman marked for survival, destined to be claimed by their god. The descriptions of their rituals, blood sacrifices, locked rooms, a cloaked figure, matched the massacres too closely to ignore. Elena's hands shook as she read, her mind racing. Was the killer part of this cult? Or worse, something more? She pushed the thought away, but it lingered, a shadow at the edge of her mind. Her research became an obsession, her journal filling with notes about the cult, the murders, the hooded figure. She sketched him endlessly, his silhouette growing sharper with each drawing. She began to see him everywhere, in the shadows outside her window, in the flicker of a streetlight, in the corners of her dreams. The police guards noticed her growing paranoia, their reports to Ruiz tinged with concern. But Elena didn't care. She was close, closer than anyone had been to understanding the killer. She just needed one more piece, one clue to tie it all together. Late one night, as another storm battered the safe house, Elena sat at her table, the photo of her wedding day beside her journal. She was rereading her notes, cross-referencing them with Malone's latest findings. He'd sent her a scanned police file from a 1972 massacre, another case with a single survivor. Buried in the report was a grainy photo, taken at the crime scene. In the background, barely visible, was a hooded figure, his posture identical to the wedding footage. Elena's blood ran cold. The killer hadn't aged, his silhouette unchanged across decades. She stared at the photo, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a man. This was something else. Something that had haunted her since childhood. Something that wouldn't stop until it had her. The storm raged on, thunder shaking the walls. Elena's pen scratched across the page, her thoughts racing. She was close to the truth, but the truth was the killer was out there watching, waiting. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that he would come for her again. The photo, the tape, the voice, they were all messages, reminders that she was. And as the rain pounded the roof, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer than ever, his shadow just beyond the locked door, ready to claim what he believed was his.
The safe house felt smaller with each passing day, its walls closing in on Elena Voss, now Sarah Klein, as if the world itself were conspiring to trap her. The apartment was a cage of shadows, the drawn curtains blocking out the city beyond, leaving her in a perpetual twilight of fear. Every noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a pipe, set her nerves on edge, her hand instinctively reaching for the kitchen knife she kept close. The photograph from the killer showing her smiling on her wedding day, with the words, "I'm still here," scrawled on the back, sat on the table like a taunt, a constant reminder that he was watching. The nightmares were relentless, blending the blood-soaked memories of the 1999 wedding massacre with the 1979 slaughter of her family. The hooded figure was always there, his face hidden, his voice a low, deliberate whisper. "You are not meant to die." Elena's journal, now overflowing with sketches and frantic notes, was her only outlet, a map of her obsession to understand the killer who had marked her as his own. Her work with Frank Malone, the private investigator, had become her lifeline. Together they'd uncovered a chilling pattern, a string of unsolved massacres in Chicago, stretching back to the 1970s, each with a single survivor. The similarities: locked doors, precise kills, a hooded figure glimpsed in the shadows, were undeniable. But Elena's case was different. The killer had come for her twice, sparing her while slaughtering everyone around her. The 1979 massacre of her family and the 1999 wedding massacre were bookends to a life defined by survival and loss. Malone's latest find, a grainy 1972 police photo showing the hooded figure, had shaken Elena to her core. The figure hadn't aged, his silhouette identical to the wedding footage, his presence a constant across decades. The thought that he might not be human gnawed at her, though she fought to cling to reason. The article about the Order of the Keeper, a 1960s Chicago cult that worshipped a figure who marked a chosen woman, only deepened her unease. Was the killer a disciple of this cult, or something far worse? Elena's days were consumed by research, her nights by terror. She scoured old articles, police reports, and survivor testimonies, searching for anything that might explain the killer's fixation. Her journal was a chaotic archive, pages of sketches, timelines, and theories about the hooded figure. She'd begun to see him everywhere, in the flicker of a streetlight through the curtains, in the shadows cast by her dim lamp, in the corners of her vision as she drifted into uneasy sleep. The police guards outside her door were a formality, their presence doing little to ease her dread. Detective Ruiz, the only officer she trusted, checked in regularly, but his visits were brief, his face lined with the exhaustion of a case that refused to yield answer. "We're chasing ghosts, Sarah," he'd said during his last visit, his voice heavy. "But we're not giving up." Elena nodded, but she knew the truth. The police were out of their depth. The killer was no ordinary criminal. He was a force, a shadow that existed beyond their reach. Malone's calls were her only reprieve, his gruff voice, a tether to the outside world. He'd been digging deeper, tracking down leads that the police had overlooked. One evening, he called with a new discovery, a survivor from a 1975 massacre, a woman named Clara Henshaw, now living in a small town in Wisconsin. Clara had been a teenager when her family was killed in their home, the doors locked, the wounds precise. She'd survived by hiding in a crawl space, hearing a voice through the walls. "You are not meant to die." The description matched Elena's story exactly, down to the hooded figure, seen fleeing the scene. Malone arranged a meeting, driving Elena to Wisconsin under the cover of night, her police escort trailing at a distance. The journey was tense, Elena's hands clutching her journal, her mind racing with questions. Would Clara have answered? Would she recognize the voice, the figure, the nightmare that had defined Elena's life? Clara was frail, her eyes haunted by a lifetime of fear. She lived in a small house, its windows boarded up, its doors reinforced with multiple locks. "I knew you'd come," she said as she let them in, her voice trembling. "I'd been waiting for someone like you." Over tea that no one drank, Clara told her story. The 1975 massacre was a mirror of Elena's. A family slaughtered, a single survivor, a hooded figure, who spared her for reasons she couldn't fathom. She'd heard the voice, the same words, "You are not meant to die." Clara had spent years researching, just like Elena, and had uncovered whispers of the Order of the Keeper. They believed in a chosen one, she said, her hands shaking, a woman marked by their God, destined to be his forever. "I thought it was me, but then I saw your story in the news. The wedding, the massacre. It's him. He's chosen you now." Clara's words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd suspected a connection to the cult, but hearing it confirmed by another survivor made it real. Clara showed her a box of old documents, newspaper clippings, police sketches, even a grainy photo from a 1968 cult ritual, showing a hooded figure standing over an altar. The image was blurry, but the silhouette was unmistakable.
He doesn't age, Clara whispered. He's been doing this for decades, maybe longer, and he always leaves one alive. Elena's heart pounded as she stared at the photo. The killer wasn't just a man. He was a constant, a force that defied time. Clara's final warning chilled her. He'll come for you again. He always does. Back in the safe house, Elena's obsession deepened. She and Malone built a timeline, mapping every known massacre, linked to the hooded figure. The pattern stretched back to the 1950s, each case marked by a single survivor, always a woman. The cult's influence was clear in the early cases, with reports of rituals and sacrifices, but the Order of the Keeper had supposedly disbanded in the 90s. Malone's theory that the killer might not be human began to feel less absurd. Elena found references to the cult's beliefs in obscure texts, describing the Keeper as a being who marked his chosen through blood, sparing them while claiming those around them. The text spoke of a ritual, a final act where the chosen was taken, not in death, but in a union with the Keeper. The thought made Elena's skin crawl. She began to notice small signs, things she'd dismissed as paranoia. A faint scratch on the safe house's door as if someone had tested the lock. A shadow moving past her window too quick to be a passerby. A faint smell of metal in the air like blood, though she found no source. Her sketches of the hooded figure grew more detailed, almost lifelike, as if drawing him brought him closer. She wrote in her journal, "He's here. I can feel him." The police guards dismissed her fears, but Malone took them seriously. He installed a hidden camera outside the safe house, hoping to catch the killer on film. The footage showed nothing, no hooded figure, no suspicious activity, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, waiting for the right moment. One night as a storm battered the city, Elena sat at her table, the journal open, the wedding photo beside it. She was cross-referencing Malone's latest findings with her own notes, her mind racing. Malone had sent her a scanned document from a 1965 police file, describing a massacre at a Chicago church. The survivor, a young woman, had reported a hooded figure whispering to her before vanishing. The words were the same: "You are not meant to die." The file included a sketch, drawn by the survivor, of a hooded man with no face visible, only darkness beneath the hood. Elena's hands shook as she compared it to her own drawings. They were identical. She was close to something, a truth that terrified her. The killer wasn't just a man, wasn't just a cultist. He was something else, something that had haunted Chicago for decades, something that had chosen her above all others. The storm grew fiercer, thunder shaking the wall. The power flickered, plunging the apartment into darkness for a heartbeat before the lights returned. Elena's breath caught, her hand tightening on the knife. She stared at the door, expecting another knock, another envelope, another message from the killer. But the night was silent, save for the rain. She forced herself to keep working, her pen scratching across the journal. She wrote about the cult, the Keeper, the idea that the killer might be more than human. She wrote about Clara, about the other survivors, about the pattern that tied them together. And then she stopped, her pen hovering over the page, as a new thought struck her. What if the killer wasn't sparing her out of love or obsession, but as part of a ritual? What if her survival was only temporary, a prelude to something worse? The thought was too much. She pushed the journal away, her hands trembling. She needed to talk to Malone to tell him what she'd realized. She reached for the burner phone, but before she could dial, the power went out again. This time, it didn't come back. The apartment was swallowed by darkness, the silence absolute except for her ragged breathing. She gripped the knife, backing into a corner, her eyes straining to see in the black. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the storm had brought something with it. And then she heard it, a low, deliberate voice. The same voice from her childhood, from the wedding, from the tape. "You are not meant to die tonight," it said, so close she felt the breath on her neck. She swung the knife blindly, her blade slicing through empty air. Her scream echoed in the small apartment, but no one came. The police guards outside were silent, too silent. The lights flickered back on, and she was alone. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room. Nothing was out of place, but on the table, her journal was open to a new page, in unfamiliar handwriting, sharp, and precise was a single sentence. "You will always be mine." Elena's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, the knife clattering beside her. The killer had been here in her safe house, past the locks and the guard. He'd left his message, his claim, and vanished again. She called Malone, her voice shaking as she told him what had happened. He arrived within hours, his face grim, as he examined the journal. "This changes everything," he said. "He's escalating. He's not just watching. He's ready to act." Malone checked the camera footage, but it showed nothing, just static during the blackout. The police guards claimed they'd seen and heard nothing, though Elena noticed one of them rubbing his neck, as if he'd been struck. Malone took her to a new safe house, this one even more remote, but Elena knew it wouldn't matter. The killer wasn't bound by walls or locks. He was a shadow, a force that found her no matter where she hid. In the new safe house, Elena's fear turned to determination. She couldn't run forever. She and Malone devised a plan. Bait the killer, draw him out, force him to reveal himself. Malone contacted a hacker friend to trace any digital footprints, while Elena compiled everything she knew about the Keeper, the cult, and the massacre. She wrote a letter, addressed to no one, detailing her story: the 1979 massacre, the wedding, the voice, the photo. She left it in a public mailbox, knowing the killer would find it. It was a desperate move, a challenge to the shadow that had haunted her life. "If you want me," she wrote, "come and get me." Days later, Malone called with news. His hacker had found something, a brief mention in a 1950s police report of a hooded figure seen near a massacre site, described as moving like smoke. The report included a symbol, a crude drawing of a circle with a slash through it, found carved into the door of the crime scene. Elena recognized it immediately. The same symbol had been scratched into the safe house door after the photograph appeared. It was the mark of the Keeper, a sign that the killer was closing in. Malone urged her to stay put, to let him handle it, but Elena was done waiting. She left the safe house, slipping past the guards, and returned to Chicago. She went to the Regal Hotel, now abandoned, its ballroom sealed off since the massacre. The air was heavy with dust and memories. As she stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the dark, the stage was still there, the flowers long dead, the bloodstains faded but visible. She stood where she'd stood with Daniel, her heart aching. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty room. "You wanted me. Take me." The silence was deafening, but she felt him, the weight of his presence, the chill of his gaze. She clutched the knife, her hands steady despite her fear. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. The voice came again, closer now, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "You are mine." Elena swung the knife, her scream swallowed by the black. When the lights returned, she was alone, the knife still in her hand, her journal gone. On the stage where she'd stood was a new message, carved into the wood: "Forever." Elena ran, her heart pounding, knowing she'd never escape him. The killer was no longer just a shadow. He was her destiny, a force that would never let her go. Elena Voss, or Sarah Klein, vanished that night, leaving behind only questions and a legacy of terror. The Chicago wedding massacre remains unsolved, a dark stain on the city's history, its details whispered in hushed tones by those who remember. The hooded figure, the Keeper, has not been seen since, but his presence lingers in the shadows of Chicago's streets, in the creak of a locked door, in the flicker of a dying light. Some say Elena is still out there, running from a shadow that will never stop hunting. Others believe the Keeper claimed her, not in death, but in something far worse, a union that defies the boundaries of life and time. The truth, like the killer himself, remains elusive, a ghost that haunts the edges of reality. For those who hear the story, one question remains: who will be the next chosen one, marked by the Keeper's blade, destined to survive when all others fall?